Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Cloud-Based Mayhem. Got a great show for you today that I'm really excited to share with you. Compliments of Nick Hawks, who interviewed me a few episodes ago on his own podcast, the Paleo Treats podcast. Nick Hawks is a former Navy badass and has done the Leadville 100, hiked Mount Whitney in his sandals, sailed a sailboat from California through the Panama Canal up to the Caribbean. He's done all kinds of really cool stuff, classic adventure, and interviews adventurers on his own show, so I invite you to go check that out. But about a year ago, he saw the Rockies Traverse, the project I did across the Canadian Rockies with Will Gadd, got super inspired to learn how to fly. Total newbie, but he keeps hearing on this podcast all about ground handling, and so he's taken it really seriously and decided to jump in with both feet. I think in this show we learned that he's about 98 minutes into his own career, but he's tackling ground handling and wanted to understand why it seems like the new level of learning, people just think of ground handling as getting the wing up overhead and getting off the hill, and that is definitely not what we're talking about with ground handling. That's the very, very first baby steps. So a lot of our listeners have also been asking about ground handling and can I expand on it, and Nick thought it'd be really cool to do a show dedicated 100% to the art of ground handling. So that's what we've done here. Before we get into the show, I wanted to remind all you in the UK that I'm going to be over there the second weekend of April for a short film tour. Compliments of Cross Country Magazine and Ed Ewing and Hugh Miller and all their hard work. Thanks, guys. We're also doing a couple shows that weekend, I think the 8th and 9th, up in the Lakes District at Jockey Sanderson's Flight Park, so that'll be really cool. I'll be there to show the film, but also talk about bivvy flying and X-Alps and food and expedition packing and gear and doing some flying with all of you, so I hope you'll come and join us. I think the Saturday's sold out, but we've still got some spots available on Sunday. You can find out about all that on the website, cloudbasedmayhem.com, and on the social medias. You'll find that on my Facebook page and Cross Country's Facebook page and all that. So without further ado, let's get into this show. We turned the tables around a little bit on this one. Nick was really more interviewing me, finding out about SIV and ground handling and just safe practices. I firmly believe, and a lot of other good pilots do as well, that you can learn a lot more from a couple hours of ground handling than you can from a couple hours in the air. In fact, that's an absolute. So this is a part of the sport that really saves us, makes us a lot more safe, and hopefully this will clarify some of the muddled waters about ground handling. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with my good friend, Nick Hawks. Nick Hawks, it is really cool to have you. We're going to spin the dial here a little bit, and you're gonna talk to me. But the last time we chatted in length, I was on your podcast, which is awesome, Paleo Treats podcast, which I invite our listeners to go check out. Nick talks to adventurers that are doing really, really cool stuff, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with paleo. Although you guys make some awesome treats that I super dig. I actually ate the whole box that you sent me in about 2 days. That stuff is amazing. But we're gonna have a really cool chat about ground handling, and you came to me with this idea, which I'm really excited to do. But the last time we chatted, which wasn't too long ago, you hadn't even flown yet, and now I understand you've got the sky cracked pretty bad. And so why don't you catch us up with what you're doing and how you got into flying and where you're at now?
Cool. Thanks for having me on the show. Super excited. I think like the rest of the paragliding community, I'm just really grateful that you're putting so much information out there and sharing these conversations. And that's what podcasting I think is all about. So kick it off with a thanks. I got into paragliding actually from watching the movie with you and Will Gadd. I had a buddy up in Salt Lake City who was into it, but I'd always thought it was just kind of stupid and boring, to be honest with you. And then I saw that movie and all of a sudden the potential and the opportunity was laid out in front of me. And I said like, that's what I'm doing. I had been doing a little bit of ultra running before then, and it's super nice to be in the mountains and getting that viewpoint. But I'd always had that dream of, instead of running along the trail, gliding along just above it, and paragliding seemed to be the way to do that. So that's how I got into it. Saw the movie, kind of looked around, met this really wonderful lady and instructor, and she made it super easy for me to get into flying. So started started doing it. And it's funny, most of your guests are 1,000 hour, 10,000 hour pilots. I'm about a 98-minute pilot right now.
Awesome. Now you say that probably a little bit in jest, but you sent me this list of the stuff you're doing on the ground, which is just wicked exceptional. So I think you're way ahead of the game. And one of the really common themes that you've heard me talk about with the guests a lot is ground handling, and I really like that you've pointed it out as like, oh wow, this must be really important. So it sounds like you're spending a lot of time on the ground, and hats off for that. But how's that going?
It's so spending time on the ground to me is kind of a byproduct of this situation that I've got, where the instructor I've got isn't in the same state as me, and so when we get together, we get to fly, and the rest of the time, for right now, I'm mostly ground handling. In fact, I learned the usual kind of fear-based lesson the other day, that it's not a good idea to fly early. Which it seems like that's a part of almost every pilot's progression, and I'm glad it happened and that I got down safe, but it was certainly terrifying. But yeah, I mean, let's kind of getting stuck into this idea of ground handling is hearing you talk about it over and over, hearing almost every pilot who comes on talk about it, and I started to wonder, what does good ground handling mean? And so we've got that one link to I think Olivier Fritz and Annecy doing amazing stuff with kiting, and I looked at that and realized, like, oh, that's what good ground handling is. It's more than getting the kite up over your head. But I thought it'd be super cool to ask you a bunch of questions as a really good pilot, and see kind of your thoughts on ground handling, and hopefully we get to share that with the rest of the PG clan.
Yeah, in fact, those of you listening, I'll have these links to some of the videos we're going to reference here, including the one from Olivier and Annecy, in the show notes. They're just amazing, and this video is next level. And I have to admit that my ground handling is definitely not at that level. So yeah, I'm stoked to answer your questions. But those of you listening, make sure to go check out the show notes and spend some time watching that. They're incredibly valuable, and will give you something to shoot for. There's a couple there, and they're really terrific. But yeah, no, well done pointing those out.
So starting off, Kevin, I mean, we kind of have the very beginner is building a wall and then getting it overhead, and that seems to be ground handling for a lot of people. And then you've got at the other end of the spectrum, you've got this video that will get up there. Like, what do you think of as the progression between that beginning level and that advanced level? Have you thought it out? Like, do you always get dragged when you're ground handling? Are you getting dragged all the time on your launches, or is that something that eventually totally goes away, or is it much more weather dependent, or kind of how do you think of that progression in your own mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was really fortunate when I learned it. And so much of this depends on where you are. I don't want to call these guys out because they're my tribe, and it's also one of the places that I spend a lot of time learning. But we have a site up in Issaquah, in Washington, that the pilots there are famous for having terrifically bad ground handling skills, because it's a mountain site, and it's not really a place that, if there's wind, you can't really fly. So you don't get much ground handling experience on the mountain. So unless you're going somewhere else to ground handle, I think ground handling for that kind of pilot in that location is exactly what you just said. You build a wall, you pull over your head. If you get lucky, you get off the hill. That to me is the most basic level. That's not ground handling. That's going flying if you're lucky. And I think the reason that ground handling is so incredibly critical is that everything that happens, that could potentially happen, that's bad in the air, you can mimic on the ground. And so when it happens in the air, it becomes totally benign if you have those skills. And 100 out of 100 accidents happen with contact in the ground. So
you're not going to get hurt in the air. You're going to get hurt. Well, you could potentially get a line around a helmet or a GoPro, God forbid, and snap a neck or something. But or if an acro, I dislocated my shoulder one time. But I mean, the serious stuff, of course, happens on the ground, and 99 out of 100 of those happens when you're launching or landing. So it's very rare, even from like a reserve toss or something. So I think that if whereas if you compare pilots out at Tiger with pilots that spend a lot of time, say, at the Point in Utah, where it's very windy almost all the time, and you're really ridge soaring. It's a very different kind of flying. Those guys get really good at ground handling really fast. You can take a 6-month pilot from the Point and put them against a 10-year pilot at Tiger, and their ground handling skills are 100 times better. So they're not at the level of Olivier Fritz in the video that we're going to put in the show notes, but they can, just, they're dragging all over the place on their feet. They're dancing underneath their wing. They're using their C's, or if they're on a 4-liner, their D's, or the 2-liner, they're using their B's. If it's windy, they're never tapping their brakes. They're just really solid skills that I would call foundational skills. They're last night I had a film showing up in San Francisco, and one of the guys that I was talking to after the show has just had an accident, and he was asking me what I thought about SIV. And to me, if you're going to go paragliding, and especially if you're going to go cross country, SIV is one of these things that's not a one and done. This is part of your yearly training that you have to do over and over and over again. So, I think a ratio is 10-1 in terms of ground handling versus flying. I mean, I think it's a really requisite skill. I've maybe given you a little bit more than your question there, but yeah, the short answer is that once you get good at it, there should never be any dragging. There should never be anything. You should always look elegant on launch. Kriegel looks elegant when it's blowing 40K. He still makes it look easy.
Right. So just on a numbers scale, kind of kite to flight is 10-1. Do you think that changes as you go up? Do you feel now as an expert pilot that you kind of need to and do ground handle at that level, or do you feel it as you get up to beyond whatever the numbers are, 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 hours, that ratio can change and still be pretty safe?
No, I think that very, very few pilots do, and I'm one of them, and that's totally wrong. I think that ratio should stay like that for your entire career. By far the best pilots, and when you watch acro pilots, they play all the time on the ground because they're waiting for the conditions to get right, but it's also, they turn it into a game, and it's super fun, and it's incredibly good exercise. Flying is not much exercise, but when you're ground handling, your heart rate's up, it's aerobic, it can be anaerobic. And if you bring some friends into the mix and you're tapping each other's wings, and the first time I really saw how fun it could be, I was a very new pilot. I was playing with Enlo O'Connor and his son. His son's 10 years old, and he's just a ground handling Jedi. And so I would just chase him around in the air, and we would just top land over and over and over and over again. And then when we would top land, he would kind of dance over underneath his wing, and he would just reach out and just grab something on my wing, just to make it do some kind of nasty collapse, just so I could try to recover it. I think that kind of, you have to look at it as training, and you have to look at it as this kind of training is going to save my life. I've been in places like Bir in India where you have a small launch and sometimes hundreds of pilots on launch, and there's only a couple little places to get off. It's often no wind, so people are doing forwards, which tends to get, again, this is just, a forward should never be nerve-wracking for a pilot, but typically people don't do enough ground handling, or they start really getting used to reverses. They like looking at their wing, and they lose that skill of forward launches. And I have to admit, I did too. And so when I went into the last X Alps, knowing I was going to be doing tons of sledders and forward launches and launches that were blowing over the back, so I had to run really fast. I made that part of my training regimen, and for sure, it made me a safer, better pilot. And so I think back to beer, you can go there pretty much every day during the season and see 2 or 3 accidents from people blowing launches, and it's just, in my mind, it's completely unnecessary. They shouldn't be up there until they're down in the paddock down low and they've done, 50 to 1 hours or something, before, it just shouldn't be. These are just, to me, they're senseless and totally preventable accidents. So yeah, to answer your question, if, my urge would be, and this is to myself as well, would be that you never minimize that practice, that just becomes part of your flying ritual. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to spend way more time on the ground. A very funny thing, something I've talked about on the podcast in the past, is my first super final down in Colombia in 2012. I think I talked about this on the last show, actually, with Christina. But it's the air tends to be pretty still on launch, or even slightly over the back. You got all these total air Jedis, with comp wings, and it's comical in a way, and it's also kind of like it's ridiculous to see how many pilots that are at a World Cup. These are the best of the best in terms of cross country flying, are really bad on the ground. And I think that's it. Just, there's a direct connection, there's a direct line between that and accidents, even at that level. I think that if you're bad on the ground, you might still, you could be a fairly good cross country pilot, but you could be a lot better.
Yeah, that's the question that comes up for me is you have guys who are phenomenally good in the air who are pretty crappy on the ground, and I wonder, just kind of looking at the reality of it, is that it sounds like it's a good idea to ground handle, but how much better do you get if you ground handle a bunch if you're already really good in the air? I mean, I think this is the hard question, because I don't know if there's a huge.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it's good
I
question.
think that's, it's a great question, and I think it's a really obvious. I think that's where people get caught. Well, wait a minute, this guy's just amazing, but he can barely get off the deck sometimes when it's cross or it's over the back or whatever. And the reason that's not so obvious is because when you're flying, you've got a pressurized wing, number one, and the pendulum effect takes a lot of things out of the wing. A lot of the bad stuff that could happen doesn't happen because you're hanging down underneath it. And you're acquiring all these skills that come from hours and hours in the air. How to spot thermals, where to go, how to use rotor, how to fly lee side, how to fly windward side, time of the day, angle of the sun, all the things that we use. You're flying the lower third of the sky, the middle third, the top third, all these things that we learn. But when it comes to something quick and catastrophic, or potentially catastrophic, if you have those hours and hours and hours on the ground, those potentially catastrophic things are totally benign. They just very, very rarely ever happen to somebody that's great on the ground, because it's totally instinctual. Those little things that you feel, and those tiny, tiny, tiny sensitivities that you build up from all that time on the ground, when you're looking at your wing and you're spinning it around and you understand the flow and the dynamics of the air and how that affects your wing, it just it ties directly into safety in the air. So the other side of it is I think obvious, but when accidents happen on the ground, and I'm talking about taking off or landing, then that's just purely ground handling. So these are kind of two different things. But if you say you want to get into bull piv, and you want to kind of sky camp and do some of the stuff that I do a lot of, there's a couple skills there that are really requisite. One is top landing, which is probably one, if not the most dangerous thing that I think that we do in our sport, because you're landing typically at a time of the day when it's still pretty powered up, and let's just face it, top landing's tricky. And then the other thing is, you're not flying from known sites where you've got reliable weather reports and other people standing around, and you don't have all this medio, and you don't have this local knowledge, and it's not your site. You're flying and landing and flying and landing in places that maybe no one has ever flown or landed in. And so then you're using just all the skill that you've built up. And again, it's a very fine line between snapping an ankle and just dancing around and being safe, and that's just purely ground handling. That's not luck. It's not just, I just don't think that there should be, if you're a pilot and you're having, more than a couple a year of those, like, whoa, that was close, then you're not ground handling enough. Let's face it, this is a dangerous sport, and you can just radically minimize those risks if you make this part of your skill set.
Okay, so coming from an athlete background, I feel like, I don't know if I've ever been a professional athlete, but certainly participated. Is one of the things that you do almost every time is warm up. Is there a warm up that you do ground handling when you get up? If you're going to go fly for a day, or it's a fun flight or not a fun flight or whatever it is, do you, anything other than racing, kind of get up like, all right, I'm going to build a wall, I'm going to knock out my reverse, I'm going to bring it back down, I'm going to do the Cobra launch, I'm going to bring it up, spin it left 180, spin it right 180. Like, do you have a system that you go through, or have you heard of anyone having a system like that where they just have their 10-minute kind of kiting warm up before they go? And then the second part of that question is, if you have that and you're doing that every time, is it really necessary once you get good to have that same 10-to-1 kite to flight ratio?
That another great question. I don't know of anybody that does that except in places like the Point, where you're really more, or like Torrey, or you're really more ridge soaring. Typically, when you're mountain flying, your window can be, especially in the Rockies, your window can be really, really narrow. And when you're flying, midday, like say, Sun Valley where I fly, you would never want to kite or spend any time on the ground doing any kind of exercises like that, because we're often flying when there's pretty strong dust devils coming through, and you want to get up and away. And so the answer to your question is totally dependent on where you are. If you're in Annecy on a half a mile piece of carpet and there's nobody else around, like, they would never, in that video, he's obviously gotten the okay and there's nobody around to be able to do that. But typically there's 100 people standing there waiting to get off the hill, and there's tons of tandems going, and you would never be allowed to do that. You're expected to have all of your stuff ready, your lines are clean, you're ready to go, you've got everything buckled up, you've done your 4 main checks, and you're off the hill. So it completely depends on where you are. I see the two as very, very different disciplines. One is you're going up the hill to go on a cross country flight, and you're very much, you need to be thinking about on launch. You need to be thinking about, have I got my food accessible? Are my instruments ready to go? Nate Scales calls it, no schoolboy errors. If you're in a competition or you're going for a big day, if you show up and you've forgotten your helmet, for example, or you've forgotten your shoes, or you don't have enough food, or you don't have enough water, you're already putting huge odds against yourself. Like, those
Sure.
are the kind of things where you want to go, yeah, maybe today's not my day. So by the time you're up at launch, you're solid, and you can really see the difference in the great pilots and the not so great pilots out on launch, because they're just incredibly confident and they're wicked organized, and they just unpack and everything gets laid out and they go and they look great doing it. And so to get to that point, though, they have spent well, hopefully the best ones have spent a lot of time on the ground. So I view the two as different. And I think where people mess up is they hear about ground handling and they do a lot of it in the beginning, and then they start flying and they love the flying and they leave the ground handling behind. But you have to take the bad days and go. Those are the days to go ground handle. However, the difference is if you're you it can be pretty dangerous to ground handle where there's compression or where there's thermals.
Sure.
I would just say it's you want to ground handle in a field, in a soccer field. It's okay to do it in some place where there's rotor. In fact, it's great because that mimics what you're going to be dealing with in the real world. But you don't want to get plucked because then you could potentially, of course, get hurt. So you want to do it in places that are, friendly to ground handling. Stormy and gusty is fine. There's these great stories about when Kriegel trains for the X Alps. He'll go up in some kind of valley where there's tons of snow and see how much wind he can handle. And there's rumors that he ground handles in like 60K on a regular wing,
There's always
which
that
is
guy in every sport.
considerably
That's
right, and which is
awesome.
considerably over the trim speed of a wing. But he's doing it. He's picking a place that he can get plucked. He's picking a place that's got a lot of powder snow, and he could mess up. I can't imagine Kriegel ever messing up at anything, but he's picking a place that if he gets plucked or something, it's safe. So first, make sure it's a safe place to do it. The other thing too is, for pilots in the U.S. and Canada, if you're flying in the Rockies or this kind of thing, a lot of the places that we have to go flying are really hard on your wing. There's tons of little rocks, or there's sagebrush, or there's small trees. I mean, these are not the grass-covered hills like they have in the Alps. So, in the interest of protecting what is quite an expensive piece of equipment, you also don't really want to be ground handling a cactus. You want to ground handle in places that are really kind to your wing. Like even sand, sand just destroys wings. So it's totally okay, completely okay to ground handle with a wing that's you're not planning on flying, like a smaller wing or even a speed wing. I mean, any kind of ground handling is good ground handling. It doesn't necessarily need to be the wing you fly with. You of course need to ground handle with the wing you fly with too, but beat something else up. Don't take your brand new Porsche out and rally it through the forest.
Gavin, are there kind of ground handling skills that you think of? Because this is one of the things that I kept missing when I was listening, is people would say like, oh, that guy's a good ground handler, but what does that mean? If I say you're a good runner, it's like, oh, you can run a sub 5 minute mile. Like, oh, it's a ripping runner. But with the ground handling, it doesn't seem very often that I get to hear about specific skills. So is that something you can talk about? Like everyone should be able to spin their wing 360 under control, or everyone should be able to, whatever it is, fly it backward, fly it forward? Are there things that you think about in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So one is you want to be able to handle your wing in a lot of wind, and definitely a lot of kind of unstable wind. So what that means is being able to kite with being able to bring it up when one side's completely collapsed, and just having the other A, and being really flexible with your hands. And what I mean by that is being able to steer the wing on the ground just using your C's, just using your B's, no brakes at all, using no hands, just dancing underneath it with your feet, doing all your steering with weight shift. You should be able to ground handle on your back. So, remove your feet out of the equation totally. You should be able to ground handle with a big portion of the wing collapsed, both sides. You should be able to ground handle with pulling one tip almost all the way down to the ground, and especially in higher winds. And this is super fun, just letting the wing completely tow you, but not letting it get out of control. You want to be able to helico it with ease. You want to be able to fly it backwards, just using the brakes or the D's or C's, depending on what kind of wing you've got. I mean, basically, you want to imagine that if somebody's watching you, it looks like you're just wicked in control. You want to be like the video and that we've got in the show notes with Olivier. You want to just be just totally comfortable and have it down. And so I think all those and much more. I think people also worry about like, oh, I don't want to be embarrassed.
Right.
I think that comes up a lot. And so, uh, you know, and I totally get that, but so go practice it when there's nobody else around. But that should never be holding you back. There's so many people that are sitting around on launch that are that are nervous about how they look. Well, you're already behind the 8 ball if that's what you're thinking. You want to have that in your head that even if you're low hours, you want to have in your head that the worst thing is to be really nervous on launch and to have your head flooded with all this like, ooh, I don't know. Your mental capacity then is already so sapped that when you get out into the air, your chance of bombing out are much higher than the guy or the gal that just comes to launch and just has it. And they know they've got it, and they're not thinking about that. They're a few hours down the road already. They've got all their waypoints in their GPS. They're thinking about how big can they go. They're assessing the sky. They're not thinking about getting off the hill. I promise you.
It's totally awesome. I get it. And I think there's everyone goes through this progression where you have to have a lot of that muscle memory in order to free up your actual brain to do the thinking that matters.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's just, I think that there's no, the only recipe there is training. There's no real shortcut there. I think just it's for some reason, I think it's widely viewed as like this kind of necessary evil, and that's wrong. It really isn't. Number one, it's really fun, and it's great exercise, and I, it's often just it's also just no stress fun. That if you're
Right.
doing it in a good place, you're not going to get hurt. And let's face it, flying can often be really stressful. So just it's just the easiest way and the best way. There's that in SIV really, but it's the best way. I would say it's even much better than SIV to just get good fast. You will become a radically better pilot if you spend a lot of time on the ground. This is not a skill that this is not riding your bike. This is not a skill that you just rip for the first 2 years of your career and you come back to 5 years and you haven't been doing much and you're going to be as good as you were. You're going to be terrible.
Right.
It just doesn't. It does. It's a skill that for some reason, I'm sure there are exceptions to this with certain people, but this is not a skill that hangs in your repertoire.
Yeah. And so it needs to be hammered. Okay. Hammered over and over. I'm gonna have one more ground handling question, and then I think we probably hammered this enough. We can move on to some more beginner flying stuff. But the last ground handling stuff is, do you think there's any value in having a separate wing just for ground handling? And you answered it a little bit before, but I've seen like wings that are specific to ground handling. Do you feel like a new pilot should consider that maybe not a critical part of their gear, but something really important or essential? Or
Yeah, I don't. It's nice to have. I don't think it's essential as long as you can ground handle in a place that's not going to trash your wing. I would say for sure you need one if you don't have nice grassy soccer fields or something.
sure.
If you're ground handling in the desert in the sand, then yeah, it's pretty essential to get another wing just because your porosity is going to go through the roof really fast. If you're ground handling Monterey on the beach, or doing the Pila or something, that's a different wing for sure. So sand is just the worst enemy. If you're near the ocean, salt is terrible. Salt water especially is really bad. So yeah, if it's great to have another wing if you can. You can often just pick up somebody else's old ragged out wing, just with the full knowledge that this is going to behave quite a bit differently than the wing that you fly. So you've got to get practice on the wing that you fly too. But that typically that's not the one you want to just trash. If you spend a week out at if you spend a week out at the point in Utah with your brand new wing, it is not going to look very new after that week. So it's still most of the guys out there are you're just ridge soaring, so that's totally fine to ground handle that wing to death and then go flying. But it's typically not the one that there's not a lot of people out there on their Enzo 2s.
Right. Makes sense. So shifting into some beginner flying questions is I hear you talk a lot about the breakdowns for hours, but it seems like there's a big jump. You're either kind of a 50-hour pilot or you're a 500-hour pilot. And, under 50 is your beginner, and then 50 to 500 is intermediate, and beyond that, or at some point beyond that, you become expert or at least better. Is there any more of a breakdown that you think of in your own mind if someone walks up and says they've got 2,000 or 4,000? Is there kind of classes that you put them in, or yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah, okay. So number one, if someone comes up and tells me they're a P3 or a P4, I could care less. Number one, our rating system I don't think is relevant really at all. I mean, it's kind of a guideline, but when I got the North American foot launch record, I was a P3. It just I didn't I had way I don't know how many 2,000 hours or something. I mean, I just didn't I didn't take that seriously, and I still don't. I mean, I'm not putting it down, but you can get a P4 and have 100 hours. I think it just doesn't. So
Check.
that's not relevant.
Okay.
And then and the other thing is too that hours are a really slippery sand that someone can be a pilot in Pacifica or Tory and have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours ridge soaring, and they don't know the first thing about going cross country. They've never flown in rotor, they've never flown in very strong thermals. So I think we have to think about it more. Well, I'll keep going with this too. I think that you can have somebody who's really getting after it, pretty aggressive, and well into the intermediate stage at say 75, 100 hours. 50 is super beginner, 100 is still beginner. We're not really touching intermediate at any hour level until you're well over 100 for absolutely for sure. But another variable is that 100 hours that you've gotten in 5 years, or is that 100 hours you've gotten in 3 months? How current are you? So every individual is completely different. What I like maybe better is the stages that if there are probably many more of these, but you kind of have beginner and then intermediate, and we often talk about intermediate syndrome, and that's just most simply put is overconfidence. And then you have the halo expert end of things, where you've made it through the intermediate syndrome, and that's great. And then you're now you're talking you've gotten 300 to 400 hours a year for 4 or 5 years at least, and you're also pretty aggressive. You've done the training, you've done the ground handling, you've done the SIV. In other words, you're getting pretty good. And then you've got this like, I'm so good I can't get hurt, and that is also very dangerous. So the reason we bring these up on the show over and over again, when you're a beginner, you don't really know what to be scared of.
Yep.
And then when you're an intermediate, you think you're better than you are, and so that overconfidence can really lead to disaster. And these are the kind of folks who may not understand what's going on in the day. They may I've gotten pretty good at ground handling. That guy's flying, but they don't know that guy is, say an X-Alps pilot or something, and then they fly and then they get hurt, because they're in conditions that are way over their head. One thing that happens a lot to folks is they're in the air and they don't recognize soon enough that the air or the weather has changed, and they don't have the get down skills, so they've got to suffer through some kind of terrible valley wind, or something has gone bad, and there's nothing more terrifying than being in the air than when you want to be on the ground. So yeah, I don't really think about so much about hours, because I think it can be pretty misleading. I think it just really depends on what kind of frame of mind are you in today, because that's another thing that bites people, is they may have just had a small accident or seen somebody else and they're flying scared, and that can really, it's like putting your one arm behind your back, but it's your brain.
Totally.
You're flying with less capacity, and so that can be dangerous. There's days where you have it, and there's days that when you don't. One of the recent guests I had on, Tom Payne, He talked about, well, I think one of the most valuable lessons he ever learned was when not to fly. I love that.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, we're gonna hit it a little bit later with one of the questions, but a lot of these things, as terrible as it is, you just, for me, and I think probably for a lot of paragliding pilots, because my guess is that most paragliding pilots are really driven by feeling, by that kinesthetic sense, is you have to feel it in order to learn it. You can read it in a book 100 times, and God knows I love reading, but man, the other day I launched and I looked back at that whole progression, and there was 4 separate points where it was like, Nick, you knew not to launch. If you had written down what you were doing, it would have been like, nope, that's a no-go. Nope, that's a no-go. But you don't get there until you tune into that feeling portion. So that's kind of the hours piece, and it's super dependent, and I think that makes sense to me. If you were to think, looking back on not just your career, but looking at or thinking about the people you've talked to now, where you've got more of an in-depth conversation than maybe a less curious person would, is there a progression that you would want to lay out for a pilot past flight school, right? So you go to flight school, you get your P2, or maybe get your P3 if you're at it for a while. Like what would you say to make the perfect pilot, or at least the really safe pilot? What would happen over the first, say, 3 years if they're flying, I don't know, 10 hours a month or whatever it is? What would you kind of recommend or prescribe?
Boy, a whole bunch of things. So first, I think, and this is a common one that comes up, because I asked this question with a few of our guests, and a really common answer, which I totally agree with, is if you can, live in the right place. What I mean
Okay.
by that is, it's you have to get time. And so the more time you can get, if you live in a place where you can't fly that much, then ground handle. That's the easy one. But if you can be in a place that has a community of pilots, uh, and that you can fly on a pretty regular basis, there's just nothing better than time. Surround yourself with the pilot or pilots that you want to become. So I think this one's super important. If you if you want to fly a lot, hang out with people that want to fly a lot, because and hang out with pilots that are better than you are if you can, because they're going to teach you. And there's nothing competitive about paragliding, really. I mean, there is a little bit in competitions, but even in competitions, everybody has been through the ringer at some point. We all see way too many accidents, and we don't want to ever see any more. And so you can ask anybody. You want to be, I guess I want to encourage people to be the softest, most malleable sponges they possibly can. So really soak it up, and remember that if you can't fly, there's so many other things you can do. Get used to checking your gear all the time. Are your pins in your reserve? Are there any fray in your lines? Is there, check everything and check it and check it. Get really good about making sure your 4-point check, your chin strap, and your harness straps, and your shoes are tied. These kind of just the basics. If you create really good habits there, that's going to go a really long ways. And then there's amazing resources. There's this podcast, but
Sure.
there's great books. Thermal Flying by Burkhard Martins. You need to read that and then read it 10 more times. There's fantastic Dennis Pagan stuff, Mads Syndergaard. There's Kelly Farina, who I had on the show a while back.
Yep.
His book is terrific. So in the winter or when you can't fly, just learn as much as you possibly can. The thing that typically gets people is weather. And so you need to understand meteo. If any of you are out there, your listeners, and you're thinking about getting into flying, if you're a whitewater kayaker, if you're a kite surfer, if you're a sailor, you have a huge edge up. There's a really weird tie between kayaking, whitewater kayaking, and paragliding. Guys and girls that whitewater kayak that get into paragliding get good really fast, and that's because water dynamics are the same as air dynamics. And so they just intrinsically understand how air moves, even though air is invisible. And so they understand that. And then kayaking's kind of freaky. And so I think it fits that kind of fear profile or risk profile that helps you to become good pretty fast. But back to your progression, there's nothing that can replace time. I wouldn't jump into an SIV immediately. You want to have, 50 hours under your belt, maybe 75 hours under your belt, but definitely you want to do SIV, before you really start popping into any kind of real cross country, and your first SIV is just that. It's your first SIV. You are not that good after you come out of an SIV. Andre Prochaska, one of our guests, was an acro guy, and he was told that he needed to do 300 full stalls before he would even be taken seriously. And I totally agree with that. SIV is something that you make part of your yearly routine. People will go, well, yeah, but it's kind of expensive. Yeah, but this is your life. So, spend the time. It's like a woofer. You forget wilderness first response, and that's why you got to go through the research all the time. It's the same with SIV. It's the same with ground handling. You just need to keep revisiting it. You need to keep working on the foundation, to keep working on the basics, because if you're going to fly cross country, I promise you will get in a bad situation. Build up your toolkit, because the more you train, the more tools you're going to have in the bag, and the more that stuff is just going to be benign. And you can land and you can smile and go, yeah, I had that move.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Jeff Shapiro podcast that you had, where he talked about doing whatever that corkscrew maneuver was. Like, thank God I did that a million times, and it was just a natural thing. When you have it, it's nice to pull it out of that tool bag, and it's all shiny and sharp and ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's when you have to train yourself to be able to think in stressful conditions, and for some people that comes pretty naturally. They don't wig out, they stay calm and they do it. But for most people, the tendency is to panic. If you panic in a paraglider, that's not going to go very well. And so the only way around that is to train. And that's why, I think the fallacy of SIV, I've done a couple of them, that's probably enough. It's just not. Every time you do it, you're going to learn something. Every time you do it, you're going to get more confident. The first time is the only thing that the first one does is, gives you a little bit more trust in your wing, because you're like, wow, I could do some really bad things to this thing and it's totally fine. That's great, because that boosts your confidence. But really all it does is shakes the cobwebs out a little bit and shakes the fear out a little bit. And it gives you, some more confidence, which is great. You need confidence to fly well. But, it's not really until you get to the third, fourth, fifth one that you're actually really taking on, you're taking information on board. When you get out of an SIV and you go do a bunch of full stalls on your own without an instructor, that's when you're making progress.
Got it. But that's not a prescription to do that after your first one.
No, definitely not.
Gavin, would you say, so it sounds like the kind of the foundational skills of paragliding are first kiting, and then you do your, launches and lands. And then at some point pretty early on in your career, you do your first SIV. Would you consider that a foray into acro would be a foundational skill for an aspiring XC pilot?
Absolutely. Just, yeah, I almost could just say that and stop. I mean, I'll say more because it's important, but it's, again, you're to have a long career in flying, number one, that old saying, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots. And this is something I fight personally big time. So people that know me know that I tend to fly on the very risky end of things. And that's what allowed me to get good really fast, but it is really dangerous. And that's just my personality. So I'm not inviting people to follow that in any way. But I think luckily I got through that intermediate syndrome stage, and now I'm trying to be much more mindful of just being smart. And that to me means training. And that to me means acro is totally a piece of that pie. You just have to, you should do acro training. And with this caveat, you want to do it in a controlled environment, especially in the beginning. You're not learning over the dirt. You've got an instructor. They're good. It's a good instructor, and you don't take it too fast. I think the one maneuver that gets a lot of people in trouble is wing overs. It's one of the most demanding and hardest moves there is, and it's usually the one that people start trying in the beginning. And so, have some respect for that move. Don't do it low. Take your time, because there's a lot of things going. In a good wing over where you're basically looping and you're completely over the wing, completely upside down in a proper wing over. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of weight shift. There's a lot of timing. There's a lot of break at certain times, and if you mess it up, it can get pretty ugly. So do it smart. That is something you want to take slow. Acro training, but absolutely, it's in that toolkit. Pal Tackett's is one of the X-Alps pilots. This time he was in it, I think 2009 or so. But his thing is acro. He's a professional acro pilot, Red Bull pilot, and for him to go do the X-Alps is kind of a no-brainer. You can just imagine a guy with those kind of skills. He also flies now very good cross country, but imagine a guy with those kind of skills in strong winds and strong rotor. I mean, there's not too many things that are going to put him in a bad place because of his acro training.
Right. So foundational for sure. Let's go a little bit along that feeling line where you're talking about wing overs demanding a good feel for the wing, and skip back a little bit earlier in the pilot's progression to use of instruments. Definitely in the States, it's almost like a culture that we love gear and we geek out on technical crap. And the more you can, festoon your body with electronics, the better. What are your thoughts on, as a beginning pilot, are there pieces of gear that you should not use until you, say, earn them through some amount of hours?
Yeah. One thing about instruments that can be really valuable is wind speed. And so when you start flying cross country, if you don't have anything that's giving you wind speed and direction, then that's something that can be a little bit dangerous. So I'll put that out there as the one caveat. You should fly without a vario on a regular basis. And in the beginning, there's way too many other things going on, and you don't need a vario. In fact, you shouldn't have a vario. And so, have nothing except your, a tracking device, and if you're in some kind of remote place. But way better to develop the feel, and way better to not cloud your mind with more unnecessary information. There's nothing more magical than catching a thermal and tracking it and coring it, and know that you're going up just by looking around, and watching that horizon disappear. In terms of training, I think it's really valuable to every year put that thing away, stick it back in your bag, and just fly by feel. I think that we get way too locked into instruments, and we lose that, birds don't have instruments and they do just fine. And so I think it's again, I think a lot of people look at flying for fun, and I personally, and it absolutely should always be fun. And if it's not, don't do it, because it's too dangerous. It should be fun. That's the number one rule. But take every flight as an opportunity to train. Take every flight as an opportunity to get better. And if you do it that way, then you're going to get better much, much faster, and you're going to stack the odds.
Cool. Dig it. That sounds pretty awesome and super good
and
advice.
All that beeping kind of sucks. It's been really funny traveling with North Unknown. We don't actually explain what the vario is in the movie like we did in the Rockies Traverse.
Yep.
And so the pilots all know what's going on, but the audience, one of the questions, I'm now leading the talks off with, hey, the beeping is vario and this is what it does. But it's, when you're watching it, when I'm sitting in the audience and watching it from and imagining that I'm not a pilot, it's pretty distracting. You're in this beautiful place and you got all this beeping going on. What the hell's all that beeping about? So it's pretty nice to just put that away,
Yeah.
and just fly by feel.
Gotta dub that shit out, man. Come on. uh,
Totally.
Over and over on the podcast, there's always the point where you talk about mistakes or pilot error. Is there, and this is kind of tied in, two questions. Is you've been flying long enough and in big enough conditions to have had, you should have had a couple, well, not should, but it wouldn't be surprising if you'd had a couple big accidents by now, but you haven't. Is there something that you attribute to that? Is there a mantra beyond your 4-point check? Is there something that you say to yourself, like, or something that you would recommend to pilots that you feel like, hey, this series of events has kept me safe, or this series of actions I take before I fly keeps me safe?
Gosh, I want to say this with some humility, but I also want to say it with the knowledge that a lot of my mentors and peers know me very well, and they've flown with me, and I'm not sure. I want to say it so they don't disagree as well. No doubt that there's part of it's maybe 52 lives that I have.
Sure.
There's no doubt there's been some luck in there. I did have the little crash on the Rockies Traverse, and that was a real eye opener for me. I mean, I didn't get really hurt, but I put myself in a terribly dangerous position, and really did. I think I made some decent decisions to only kind of get hurt instead of really get hurt. But I'd like to think that a lot of it is training. I've taken that side of things pretty seriously. The other side is something that has been a common theme in my life in other sports, in the kayaking and the climbing and skiing. Not really so much the sailing, but I guess to an extent. But I think all those have really given me a very good understanding of how the air works, they've also taught me a lot about the value of staying calm. And I have this weird, it's actually a physiological thing. It's not something that I control at all, but they did some studies on me back when I was kayaking. When I get in, some heart rate monitoring, when I get in really dicey positions, really stressful positions, my heart rate actually drops. I think you and I actually talked about this a little bit on your show. You actually, I think, had a name for it, but I can't remember what it's called. But I get really calm and really focused, and when things get twisted and bad, and I think that has, I know I can think of several times, at least, that in my paragliding career that's saved my life. Just being able to process and think about options really fast, and I guess just have the confidence that I could get out of it. So Will Gadd was constantly calling me the eternal optimist. I think that bothered him in a lot of ways, because he's always thinking about what could go wrong, and I'm always thinking about how it's going to go right. So far that's played okay for me, but I'm honestly, I'm still really trying to balance that. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but for me, it's that confidence that I got this, which I think has really come in handy in quite a few places with flying. I think that has been more of the reason than the training or the checks or being really super organized. Because honestly, especially the organized side of things, that's not my strong point.
Sure. And I mean, there's a $1 billion industry teaching or trying to teach confidence to people, and obviously it's not working because the industry is still around. So it's I don't think it's a good question to say like, well, how did you get so confident, Gavin? Because it doesn't seem to matter that what works for one person doesn't work for another, and it's based on life experience. But that combination of confidence and training is probably as close as anyone will get to having a formula for it.
Mm, mm. I'm definitely thinking a lot more now, and I don't think this is age. I think it's just, I'm just realizing, yeah, well, in the last couple of years, well, basically, I was hearing, from the guys who I really look up to, Nick Reese and Nate and Matt, and these guys that I fly with at home, like, hey, man, take it easy. I was hearing that a little bit too much, and I started really, rather than, going, oh man, I got it. No, don't worry about it. I took those comments really, really seriously. Like, what are they seeing in my flying that they don't like? What are they seeing in my flying that makes them nervous? And how can I, how can I change that? Jeff and I talked a little bit about that too. Jeff Shapiro,
Yep.
he was going through kind of similar stuff.
Yeah, maybe not flying the X-Alps, but then you wouldn't be you. That's the
Yeah,
deal.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I got to do that. There's only some things I can do.
Yeah. You're put here on the planet to use what you got.
Right.
That's how it goes. So one of the things I'm hearing a ton on the podcast is you ask the question, hey, when should people move up on a wing? And basically, if I was going to distill it down to one word, it's, after you get to a B, never. And it doesn't matter if it's a really advanced pilot or, I mean, I guess you've got me and Cedar as your two super beginners. Can you talk about that a little bit, and why do so many people completely ignore that advice?
They get wrapped up in this whole thing where they take off on glide with guys that are on comp wings and they're on a B and they get out glided and it makes them angry, or they end up on the deck and those guys get out. And so, there's this huge motivation to move up on wings to fly distance. The higher end wings glide better, and so your potential for going far is pretty radically increased by going B, C, D comp, and so that's what motivates people. But to answer your first question, for sure you shouldn't stop at B if if you have the skills and you have uh, the mental strength and fortitude and the right kind of, if you're flying well and you've got the hours, then absolutely you should move up because they're just magnificent pieces of equipment. The comp gliders and two liners and stuff are just really dreamy to fly. And so I'm not saying, oh, I want to encourage you all to go out on a hotter wing. You just have to really understand the consequences and the potential consequences. You have to have the training. And so I look at it the same as I used to with kayaking. I think it's a really good analogy. If you do any, river trips, we used to always talk about you don't paddle class 4 until you're nailing every single eddy at class 3. You're just dominating a class 3 river. That's when you're ready for class 4, or 4 minus or whatever,
Sure.
And same with kind of climbing, I guess, when you're just killing it and you're killing the 11 C's and 11 D's, then you're ready for 12s, so the analogy I think is very correct with paragliding. When you really feel like your wing is holding you back, then that's maybe a time to start considering that. Hours wise, there are Josh Cohn is just dominates our competition scene in the U.S. And I think he said he flies like 75 hours a year, but he's flown so long and flies so much that this doesn't really apply to him at all. He could fly whatever he wants and just kill it. And he's got the skills and he does a lot of SIV training and acro training and all that kind of stuff. But really, to me, if you're not flying, at least 150 hours a year, that's not, you shouldn't be moving up. That, you need to be getting at least that many hours in real hours, not ridge soaring hours to move up to a hotter wing. But just to give you an example, a friend of mine from home, Willie Cannell, this year, I think we all took off from Baldy. We were all flying, at least D's, and he was flying a Nova Mentor. And I think he went farther than all of us, so it's not, you have to make the wing that you're flying work for you. And I'm going to call Cedar out here. In the last show when we had him on, he talked about a pretty scary incident that happened at Marshall, and I didn't call him out in the show, but it didn't occur to me at the time, but I thought about it afterwards. If you go back and listen to that one, you'll hear him talk about he was flying with some really good pilots from Marshall one day, and they got up and went over the back. And to go over the back, you've got to clear these big, high tension power lines. And so the first time he kind of turned to go and he realized he didn't have enough height. I think he was on the Nivea Cook, so kind of a low end B. And then so he went back to the house thermal and got up and went for it again, but he didn't have enough height. And so he realized he wasn't going to make it over the power lines, turned into the wind, realized there was a lot more wind than he thought. Thought, okay, well, I'll just top land here in front of these tension lines. Got a little bit lower. There was even more compression lift on the hill, as there always is, and couldn't really top land and got boosted back and went right through the power line. So the top of his wing hit the top line, his harness hit the bottom line, lost control of the wing, thought he was going to die. Luckily, the thing kind of reinflated right before he hit the ground. I did quite a bit of damage to the wing, but he walked away. So he got super lucky. And so I asked him in the show, well, hey, what went wrong there? What happened? And he said, well, part of it was bad luck. And I have to totally disagree with that. He has to fly the wing that he has, and knowing that wing doesn't have as good a glide, that means you got to get more height before you make that move. So I don't think there was much bad luck involved there. I wasn't there. I can't say.
Sounds like there's some pretty good luck involved.
It sounds like there's a lot of good luck involved. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And the point of that isn't to call Cedar out. The guy's getting after it, and I love it. It's awesome.
Rad.
But it's totally rad. But it's the point is I think you need to, to avoid those incidences, you have to make really good calls on the equipment that you have. That wing's not holding him back. It just means flying it a little bit differently. And you're not going to keep up with guys on comp wings, and that's okay.
So that brings up something, and I mean, this is an engineer question, and I don't think you are. I certainly am not an engineer. But God, you had a recent guest on who was saying there really wasn't that much performance difference. It was like 3 or 5% between a D and a B. It was something where I kind of listened to it. I was like, man, I should have listened to that again. And I guess my kind of open question is there really a difference? If there's two identical copies of Gavin, one's flying a B and one's flying a D, pretty obviously the D's going to do better. But I always wondered by how much, and how much would Josh Cohn or Kriegel be limited if all they could fly was, a higher B? Would they start losing competitions?
So I percentage-wise, I don't remember that conversation, but I'm the furthest thing from a wing designer there is. I'm like you. I am not an engineer, so I can't put a figure on it. But the differences are considerable, and your glide difference is considerable, and your speed is considerable. What he might have been talking about is flying downwind. There's very little difference. Okay. When Will Gadd and I went across the Canadian Rockies, I was on a D, he was on a B. There was very rarely any discernible difference, but that was because the wind was typically either cross to us or in our favor, blowing us downwind. The times that it becomes really evident is when you're using speed bar and when you're going into the wind. So no one is going to win a World Cup on a B against pilots that are on comp wings. There could be weird things happen, and everybody bombs out and that guy stays in the air, and but no, just glider to glider, the differences are pretty considerable. There's huge drag difference, and there's the higher end wings are much more spanny. That's what makes them more dangerous, but they're much more efficient through the air.
Okay, cool. Shit, I'll have to listen to that again. I guess I was wrong. Damn.
Well, no. I mean, those percentages might be that actually might be accurate, and it doesn't sound like much, but when it comes to like comps, the tiniest differences in glide and speed are everything. It's why 2 years ago everybody is flying the Enzo 2, because the Nivic and the Gin were less than probably 2 or 3% lesser wing, and that's everything. I mean, there's no one's flying those wing. Well, a few, but you look at the results these days, and it's just ozone, 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 ozone. So, and that happens. That the other companies will make a great wing, next year potentially, and it'll all flip flop. But at the comp level, people, it's the tiniest difference makes a huge difference when you're flying around a race course.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, look no further than NASCAR or IndyCar or F1. I mean, little differences.
Right. Yeah. Hundreds of seconds. Right.
Big results. Paragliding in general seems like such a feel sport. It's not really super dependent on anything else. It doesn't matter if you're a phenomenal athlete or you're super strong. That has no bearing on whether or not you fly well. But it's also this really technical sport, which is kind of the engineering side. So you're marrying basically the emotional side to the rational side of your brain. I'm going to ask you a question that I don't think anyone can answer, but I'd like to hear the response. Is that, can you talk a little bit about how you learn the technique of something when it's almost all feel?
Golly, that is a good question. I'm reminded of a line that Matt Biesner said in 500 Miles to Nowhere. He's like, "How does a paraglider work? It works by magic." You look at that thing and it can't possibly work. It's got to be magic. I don't know if I can answer that. It's certainly, what's really interesting, I think, is that there are a lot of engineers in this sport, and they have a rationality where I find that many of them don't get very excited in the air. And when I'm talking about excited, like they don't get freaked as easy,
right?
Because it's all a matter of working out the mechanics. Everything that's happening, there's a reason, there's an action and a reaction. And, so it's all very logical. I'm the opposite of that. I'm a complete feel guy and a kinetic learner. And, but how to go about teaching that, I don't have a clue. And that might be because I don't do a lot of instruction. That's a good question, I think, maybe for somebody smarter than I am.
Sure. I mean, it's like teaching people how to swim. You just kick them in the pool and let them figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is a ton of technique, but it's not something that's easily transferable, especially because you're not sitting right there next to them when they're doing it. You're talking to them on the radio, and talking them through it, talking about weight shift and brake pull. And, there's the obvious stuff like doing too much or too little. Like in SIV, the first time people do SIV, they never do it radically enough. I always tell them to go in there like, "Hey man, just when he tells you to frontal, grab those lines and yank them, go for it. This is your opportunity." But,
right.
Not just kind of like, "Oh, I don't know, but, I guess it's back to that whole time thing.
Yeah. Magic's magic. I mean,
right.
That's probably the siren call of paragliding and these kind of sports that combine technical stuff and feel. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So jumping into some other stuff, I just had some thoughts. If there was a helmet that you could put on that had a little screen that came down in front of you, like a fighter pilot's helmet, had a little heads-up display, and it would show you through, say, colors or gradients of colors where the thermals were and the wind was, is that something that you would want to use a bunch, or would you not get much enjoyment out of that after the novelty wore off?
God, I think every single one of us has thought about that, and I hope that I hope no one ever makes that. I think it would just rob us of the magic, and it would make the whole beauty and the frustration of paragliding disappear, and I think it would match everybody up. It'd be more like basketball, and where all you needed was the wing and the good equipment, and everybody could be potentially not the same but pretty similar. Yeah, I hope they never invent that. I very much want to remain like a bird, and or have the sensation that I'm a bird, where it's, where some days you're just on and it's working and it's magic and you feel like you had it, and every day can't be like that, and that's what makes it so amazing. This is the only sport I've ever undertaken that's had me so totally wrapped for so long. Most sports I get into, I just dive into them because they fascinate me, and it's awesome. But I get to a certain point where I feel like I've either plateaued, or I realize I don't know, it just loses its luster. And paragliding is one of these things where I just know without beyond a shadow of a doubt that I'm never going to get, I'll always be able to get so much better. And I like that. And I think if we had a tool like that, it would just rob it of its essence.
It would allow you to retro bolt the sky. And there's plenty of people who don't want that.
Yeah, totally. Bill Belcourt, I love it. Yeah, that's awesome.
Let's see, there's a fella you had on, I think he was a test pilot for, maybe it was Ozone, but he was talking about the new materials coming in paragliders. I was just thinking kind of the next thing is, it seems like right now there's lines that are load lines, like they're the ones that kind of keep you attached to the wings, and there's control lines. I'm imagining a lot of that disappearing, so that's only load lines, and then all the control stuff is worked via like a Wi-Fi, and you're flying much more of a solid wing and less of an inflated wing. Do you think about wing design and where it's going and what's next, and like what you would want in the wing of the future?
I don't much, because again, my brain just doesn't, when we were interviewing Bill Belcourt during 500 Miles to Nowhere, I asked him a similar question, are we there? Is it just going to keep going? And he said, I gave up 10 years ago on trying to anticipate what could potentially happen in the sport. I thought we were done with advances in the mid '90s, and look what's happened. They just keep getting better. It's like I have no idea how they can get better, but they just keep getting better. And I'm kind of in the same ballpark. And Bill is a radically more intelligent guy than I am, and understands this stuff, way better than I do. But I have to park myself in that same court. I just don't. I'm not Luc Armand. I just don't. I go fly those things. I don't understand how they work. I think that we are carrying, that our gear for the X Alps is going to be, 6.5, 7 kgs with no food and water. That is amazing.
Jeez.
I mean, that is so awesome that we can, fly a couple hundred miles in one day, potentially on a good day on stuff that's, that's that light. It's just phenomenal that the wings are, that we're one of my next shows is going to be a redo with Jeff Shapiro, because he's gotten totally into paragliding in the last year. He's just crazy about it. And he's been a hang glider forever. I think he's got close to 10,000 hours or something. Ooh. And we just talked today, and he's so in love with it right now, because he can put it on his back and go places.
Yeah.
Just can't do that with a hang glider. And so, for sure they're going to keep getting lighter. Nivik just came out with a tandem, single surface tandem that's like 1.2 kgs. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So, I think that side of it for me, with my, kind of love of Vol Biv and Hike and Fly, is really, really cool. But I don't understand how they're going to keep it. At some point they're going to hit at some point it can't keep going, I wouldn't think, but they do, so we'll see.
Yeah.
I like that remote control idea. That's wild.
Yeah. I mean, at some point we're supposed to sail off the edge of the earth, but still out there on the wide, dark sea.
Right.
The second thing was just looking, I'm in San Diego, or the next thing was looking around on the map and seeing that Baja is just this big spine running north to south. I don't know if anyone's flown the length of it, and it just seemed like a pretty rad trip. Maybe not as burly as anything else, but there's got to be something pretty cool in there.
Yeah, and so I have to say, my comment about Alaska is totally that's very uncreative. There are a million things to do in this sport, and I've got my eye on a ton of them. That your Baja idea is brilliant. Baja would be so rad. That would be really neat, and I don't believe anybody has done it, so why not? That would be terrific. It'd be really cool, in fact. But there are tons and tons and tons of lines all over the world, and the great thing about what happened with wing technology back in 2009 is it went from 100-mile flight being a pretty big deal to 200. Just overnight, it doubled what we could do, and so it just allows us to look at lines in completely new ways, and we have barely touched the surface. And one of my favorite lines in the Rockies Traverse is right at the very end when Will goes, we can take these gliders and fly into a place like this and come out the other side. Where in the world can we do that? And the answer is everywhere.
Everywhere.
And so we're where I don't know, surfing was 30 years ago. It's just we're at the very beginning of what's going to happen, and that's insanely exciting.
So exciting, yeah. So the next thing I've got is I was looking at Baja again. It's like, oh, is it possible to cross the Cortez Sea and not do it in a cheap shit way where you're doing it right at the mouth of the old river? You're doing it somewhere down by the tip. And I really wonder about flying over oceans and water because, I mean, they must have. It's not like the air over them is static. It can't all be sinking. There has to be something going on. And if you've sailed, I've sailed, you know that there's cumulus out there. So that means that they're thermals. It's got to be possible.
No, those cumulus are different.
Are they? Okay.
So yeah, they're they're not being formed from so much from heat. You do need dirt to make thermals. And certainly they're not supportable thermals. The only way to really cross any kind of real body of water is with a paramotor. And the problem with that is you have any kind of motor failure, you're basically dead. There's not really, if you have like an easy way to eject before you hit the deck and have some kind of you've either got a boat crew following you or something, but landing in the water with a paramotor is pretty much certain death. That's not a good thing. I mean, it's not nice to go in the water with a 80-pound contraption tied to your back. So that's metal. So as of now, I don't. I mean, maybe I'm just not creative enough, but I don't see that. I don't see that happening in any kind of a safe way.
Okay. I guess the other part was thinking, like, is there some way to tow way up over the tip of Baja and just take off on one big long glide and have some massive paraglider that has huge glide?
Well, you could work that out. You could work. In fact, Tom Payne has a really cool app where you can put in all your basic variables. In this case, just height and distance, assuming it's completely still air, or maybe preferably a whole lot of tailwind or something, and it'll just tell you if you're going to make it. It'll tell you. Well, basically, it'll tell you the glide that you would need to make it, and then you can interpolate, like, okay, well, this wing I get a 12-to-1 glide, which would be extraordinary. That'd be a really good glide, and then okay, I need 7,000 feet altitude or something. Yeah, sure. That's totally possible. Okay, so yeah, you're more creative than I am.
There's a maybe there. All right.
Maybe, yeah, there's a maybe.
And then I was looking at the foot launch distance record. That's still yours? 200 some odd miles.
Yeah, 240.
So I was looking at the map again, looking down.
Well, I have to say that the North American foot launch record, the guys down in Brazil have gone way farther.
So I was looking at the map and looking at Antarctica, and it's got that little arm sticking out going towards South America. And that's, of course, down the Roaring Forties where there's tons and tons of wind. And so I was wondering what it would look like. That would be a project to launch off some part of that mountain chain and just see how far you can ride that wind, because it's going 50, 60 miles an hour, and see if that would be a new place to set the record.
So the problem with wind in the mountains is it's insanely dangerous. And the reason those guys are going so far in Brazil is they're flying in quite a bit of wind, but it's totally flat. It's a desert. And so they're not flying in rotor. My flight, the reason I went that far was certainly because of the wind. I was hitting 110, 120K downwind in a couple places in the flight.
Dang.
As long as I was on the windward side of stuff, it was fine. And as long as I was high, when I was up 16, 18,000, it was smooth and wonderful and just beautiful popping clouds that just happened to be coming out. I mean, I was totally in sync that day with what was going on the ground. But when I was low and a couple times on the lee side, it was full on combat flying, and I would never want to do it again. I mean, it was one of those brilliant flights I've ever had in my life, but you play that game a few times, you're going to lose. And so, yeah, the problem with the Andes is the wind, and they're in the mountains. Anything more than 30K of wind is wicked dangerous. It's just not, and 7 or 8 years ago, that was 15K. The only reason we can fly in more wind now is because the wings are faster. But yeah, more than that, it's literally a flip of the coin, and most of the time it's going to come out the wrong side. So, for flying in any kind of real wind, you need to be doing it in the flats, and so that's why they're going big in Australia. They're places that they're towing. Brazil's really unique because the reason those guys have the foot launch record is because they're popping off a little tiny hill, and it's really windy. It's kind of sketchy launch, and then they fly over the back, and then it's basically flat. So they're able to fly in a lot more wind safely. But even then, you get power lines or even small trees or houses, and things can be pretty. You got to be looking ahead. But wind is just not fun.
You don't think you could get up high enough and get into a wave where you're just much, much higher than you would be normally and ride that?
Okay, waves different. Yeah, that's how the sailplanes go huge, for sure. And some crazy person might potentially do that, but wave in a paraglider is people have flown in wave. Will got caught in wave in Colorado, and Hansa was in wave in the last X Alps. So it does happen. It can happen. Planning for it can be pretty tricky, but and I don't really. Hansa would be the one to ask about that because his meteorology background. But again, wind. Paragliders don't do that well in a lot of wind, and so. And from what I understand, wave is not necessarily really friendly. So I think that, but hang gliders have done it, so we can do it. So yes, I think the answer is yes to that, but I'm not the best person to ask.
All right, so two out of 3 are possibilities. Or maybe 3 out of 4.
I can't wait to see what you're going to be doing in a few years. I love it.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. Cool. Well, Gavin, that's all the questions that I had written down, man. Thanks a ton for your time, and thanks for making this thing public. I think it's really cool what you're doing.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. Those were great questions, and I've got a huge smile on my face thinking about all this madness. That's what it is. It's madness. It's awesome. So thank you, and let's do it again. See you soon.
Yeah. Maybe when I actually get to be on more than an hour. Fucking A.
Cool. All right, bud. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good, man. Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that. It was kind of cool to get back to the beginning and think about all the things we all need to be thinking about a lot more of. I hope you found that really valuable. Thanks to Nick for asking all those great questions. Check out the show notes from this show, cloudbasemayhem.com. Down in the show notes, you'll find the links to the videos we talked about in the show. Compliments to Nick, some really great material there that'll give you a great visual on what fantastic ground handling should look like. Also, go check out his show at the Paleo Treats podcast, and check out the stuff that he and his wife are making. They are absolutely delicious, I promise you, and that's going to be a big part of my fuel for the X Alps. As always, all we ask for is $1 a show. If you've got something out of this show or one of the previous episodes, or if you're just finding the podcast, go back and check out some of the incredible material we've gotten from so many great pilots over the last couple years. Cody Matank, Will Gadd, Jeff Shapiro, so much good material there, and a lot of fantastic advice. I've just returned from Salt Lake. We've got some fantastic shows coming up. The Bill Belcourt podcast, which I've been promising, just banged that out today. So that'll be coming up shortly. Sat down with Chris Santacroce with Superfly. I've got a whole bunch of really fantastic shows coming up in the weeks ahead. So, but yeah, if you want to contribute to the show, this is a listener-supported podcast. Go to thecloudbasedmayhem.com. You'll find all the links there, and we've got a new way for you to support the show through Patreon, patreon.com/cloudbasedmayhem. If you go to that page, you'll see some really cool footage that's actually not even in the film from North Unknown. You can see that, and you can kind of just set it and forget it. It's like supporting NPR or something, where you just make a monthly donation. It doesn't go up from that. Your donations go a long way to making this possible. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one. Cheers.